So now, in the eye movement sections, I showed you some very simple ways of essentially using eye movements to create change in memory. The problem is with post-traumatic stress is that the memory is quite complicated. Events might not be all that specific. They may be over a protracted period of time or even repeated events. The person may have so many traumas, both big traumas and micro traumas, they're going to be moving their eyes for a very long time. So we need a way to actually identify much more specific elements of experience. It's not necessarily going to be memory. We're identifying specific areas of experience which might be memory that are related to the post-traumatic stress. Now, I'm going to show you the way that I do this with clients. I'll have a board much like this or a flip chart, and I'll say, right, now let's just imagine we have a timeline, and that's where time began, and that's where we are today. And let's just imagine that what we have is, to keep it nice and simple, a single episode event. So not repeated thing, we're just going to pick one event. Now let's divide up time. So what we have here is that's all the stuff that came before it. That's the event itself, and this is all the stuff that comes after the event. We're going to further divide this up. This is self, so that's basically your stuff. And down here we have other. This is all the stuff that isn't your stuff. This is other people's stuff. Because what can happen with trauma, especially when trauma involves other people, so we're not talking just like a natural event, we're talking about basically violence or crime-related trauma or battle trauma. It could even be that the person's a rescuer, so they could be a fireman. But basically, where there's trauma that involves other people, there's you, and then there's others. Now, as a clinician, I can only work with you. I can't work with all of their stuff. Let me give some examples. I worked with one lady. She basically was molested by her next door neighbor from the age of 4 all the way through to her mid-20s. Now, the way this came about, or the way that the situation was revealed or came to an end, was that she was getting into trouble at work. She wasn't doing so well at work. She was having a lot of time off sick. She was referred to the occupational health department. They referred her to counselling. Within a session or two of counselling, it came out about what had been going on with the elderly next door neighbour. This guy was in his 80s by this time. And the fact that he had been abusing her from very early in childhood. That unfortunately, it got a lot of media attention. Victims of sex crimes are generally, their details are kept out of the media. That's the rule, that's the law. But the perpetrator or the accused isn't. So unfortunately, when he's named and shamed and it's revealed that he's been abusing his next door neighbour, everyone knows it's her. The naming and shaming of him pre-trial basically reveals that she's the victim of this. Now, that invited an awful lot of stuff, and there's an awful lot of stuff that wasn't her doing. For example, court appearances. She has to go and give testimony, endless police statements, media intrusion. Even though her details are kept out of the paper, that didn't stop the journalists knocking on the door asking for interviews and people photographing her in the street. You get this weird stuff that she's a victim, but because of the sensationalized aspect that people can bring to that, because of their lack of comprehension as to how such a thing could be happening, there's a lot of stuff that's other. Then there's nothing I can do. As a clinician, I can't do anything about that. And that's really important. My experience of clinicians working with post-traumatic stress is that they fall into two broad groups. There's the overly optimistic and the overly pessimistic. The overly optimistic clinicians, they seem to think that one quick technique, one quick bit of eye wiggling or a bit of tapping work or some NLP or some hypnosis work, and miraculously a person's lifelong or decade-long suffering disappears in a flash. They're generally a little bit over-optimistic, and I would suggest not entirely realistic, although there will be times when this can happen. Then normally the private therapists who do the brief therapy, they're usually self-employed, have websites, they go on personal development courses. It's that category of therapist. The other end of the spectrum, are the people that work in more organized psychiatry and psychology, who are usually more overly pessimistic. They take the view that therapy takes forever, or if it works at all, and generally the best thing we can do is manage the symptoms and basically bring a degree of relief to the suffering. But actually you can't really get people to change. I think both of those groups are utterly unrealistic. We just need to be a little bit more observant over what's going on with our client groups. So now one of the things I say to the groups, the brief therapists that think, yay, just tap your face and everything gets better, is I'll say there's a lot of stuff that therapy won't do anything about. Let me tell you this example. I worked with a gentleman. He was showing off in his car. His girlfriend and her son, it wasn't his son, it was a son from a previous relationship. He was showing off in his car, took a corner too quick, rolled the car, killed the son. He ends up in prison, inevitably. He had a few to drink as well. He ended up in prison, but a number of things happen here. Obviously, that relationship wasn't really going to sustain too well. He's killed a child. So he ends up on the protective wing, because people in prison tend not to like child killers. So he's locked up with all the rapists and the paedophiles. Now you have to bear in mind, this guy's not a career criminal, he's not a sex offender, he's a guy who was stupid. And now he's locked up for a period of years in this particular part of the prison. This is not good. While he's there, his house is burnt down by vigilantes. And of course, he loses everything, as well as he had a small business. His business goes to the wall. Everyone knows that he's that guy. There's the media attention. He's photographed going in and out of court. When he's led away, he's having his photograph taken. This is not a good scenario. And he has to live with the fact that he's killed a child. All the therapy in the world is not going to make that better. It's as simple as that. What I like to say to the other end of the spectrum, the therapists who go, things can never really get better, we just manage the symptoms and do the best we can, but people fundamentally stay the same, is I'll say, why does it take seconds to destroy someone's psychoneurology? But apparently it can change one way in seconds, but changing it back again takes forever, if at all. Why does it work that way? Because it doesn't. That's the whole thing. It doesn't. So we've got to be realistic and get the middle ground of sensibility. So not only do I teach this to my clients, I teach it to therapists, but I've also got to make sure that the stuff that I'm dealing with in the therapeutic sessions, I do more of the change work stuff as opposed to the care and support stuff. So my work is much more intervention as opposed to caring and supporting. There's a difference between those. I've got to get the person to understand what I can do something about and what I can't do something about. So, for example, if I have a client, the lady who was abused from age 4 to her mid-20s, who is pissed off because the guy, and this is what happened, the guy spent a period of time in prison, not terribly long. When he comes out of prison, he moved back home again. So now, having gone through all that, he's served his time, now he's back out. And he's her next door neighbour again. Obviously that's her childhood home, and that's because he owns that house. Can't be forced out. She thinks the law should be changed and that it's unfair and that basically he shouldn't be allowed to live there. Why should she have to move? He should be forced to move. Now, she can express that as much as she likes to me, and I can discuss that at length with her, but it's pointless. From a therapeutic intervention point of view, that is an utter waste of time. There's nothing I can do about that. The world is unfair and people have got to get used to that. So, in a way, this, as well as helping me identify what it is I'm going to work with, it also helps identify the stuff for the client, what they're going to work with. This is the way that I do this. So having given a few examples, I'll go, okay, so if we look at this lady with her next door neighbour, we start here. So it's self before the event. Well, she was only 4 at this time, and of course she would play in his garden as well as her own. She would go to tea with him, and she quite liked the guy. I mean, we put all of that stuff in there to begin with. Now we come to here. So we go from there to there. So his stuff, well, he was already going to be a paedophile. It's simple as that. He was also opportunistic. We can put all of his stuff. What are the factors that enabled him? What are the factors here that enabled him to basically bring about that event? What were the events that led up to this? So having gone to there, we now come round to here. Okay, let's just have a brief, I'm only going for the brief stuff, the nature of what this guy was up to. So basically, it was sexual abuse. It was in his house. Oh, she remembers, he is having a relationship with her mother. So we've got a degree of stuff going on in there as well. So we start pulling out the details. Now this might take a bit of time. Now we're going to come round to here. So now this is other. What were the factors after the event that basically you have no control over? So we've got things like the media involvement. We've got the justice system. We've got the neighbours gossiping. We've got all of that stuff. And of course, this is over a protracted period of time as well. So there might be a lot of details there. Now we come up to here. Okay, what is your stuff? What are you doing after all of this? Well, not going to work. Taking medication. Depressed. Crying all the time. This kind of stuff. And then we're going to come round to this. Before we get into what that is, I'm going to give you some other examples. So essentially that's the sequence we follow. Self prior, other in the event, other after the event, self after the event, then to this point here. I never reference what I call that. So let me give some other examples just to make clear what we're doing here. So I've got self and other. It doesn't actually matter which way round you do this, by the way. I just do it this way as preference. So here was one. There was a guy. He was walking home. He was a big guy. He was walking home a little bit drunk from a nightclub. He walked across town. A group of guys got a hold of him, took him off to a car park where they basically toyed with him for a while. Humiliated him in various ways, doing the stuff that bullies tend to do, before then knocking him to the floor, all gathering round, putting the boot in. Nearly killed him. He ended up in intensive care for quite a period of time. Now, what we're going to do is come through this sequence. So, self prior. So what are the factors that self contributed that basically enabled whatever's happening here, the concourse of forces, to come about? Well, he tends to go out and drink a lot. He declined the taxi home. He was walking home alone. We've put all of those details in there. All of the things, it might sound a bit blaming at this stage. We put all the things that he will have, the self-recriminations, those kind of things, that all that led up to that event. We then look at these other guys. Interestingly, he actually knew one of them from school. So we've got these guys, they're out looking for trouble. They're part of a gang. They live in a certain part of town. They get up to certain things. They drink, blah, 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 blah. We do all of their stuff too. Of course, they're hanging out in a part of town that they know they can pick off and the next victim that comes past. So there's a degree of organisation and planning on their part, whether it's overt or covert. Now, we'll come round to here. So we got started there, come round. Okay, here we go through, there's what they did in terms of humiliating him. There's the violence they enacted. There's they took his possessions as well while they were at it. There's all those kind of details. Now we come round to here. Well, there were some arrests, that kind of stuff. There was court appearances. There weren't any convictions. There's all those kind of details. There's the media involvement. There's the gossiping. There's all the stuff that people do. We do like to blame victims. It's one of those weird things. Now we come round to here. What is he doing after? Well, he now is not going out of the house. He's got some. So we've got sort of the agoraphobia. We've got the anxiety. He's drinking too much, he's smoking too much, he's taking drugs, he's not seeing his family, he's basically breaking off all contact with other people. We start listing all of that stuff out. And now we come round to this moment here. What is the moment inside the event that you did? This is the uncomfortable truth, and it's where we've got to play this really, really carefully. People are not haunted by what happened to them. That's something that therapists tend to believe. And I've watched post-traumatic stress support groups where basically, for week in, week out, years on end, people talk about what happened to them and how they feel about that. So it's basically all of this. Well, I can't change the past. I can't change what happened to you, and I can't change any of that. Yet clinicians tend to focus in on the nature of the event, what happened in the event, all of those kind of things. That wasn't what bothered this guy, who was nearly kicked to death by a bunch of guys in a car park. That wasn't what bothered him. That's what the therapist wanted him to talk about. What bothered him was when he was on the floor, curled up in a ball, thinking he's going to die. He wasn't far wrong. He said, "Please don't kill me." That's it. He said, "Please don't kill me." That is the moment. That tiny, tiny piece, in amongst all of the other stuff that happened, it's that tiny thing. The "please don't kill me." Now, picture the scene. He says to somebody, "Oh, the reason why I can't go out the house anymore, the reason I'm getting panic attacks, the reason that I can't work anymore and that I'm having nightmares and I'm drinking too much alcohol, taking drugs, smoking 40 cigarettes a day, the reason why I'm so goddamn dysfunctional is because I said, please don't kill me." It's going to sound crazy, but that is actually what happens. It is those tiny, tiny things. Because if he tries to talk about the "please don't kill me," it will often get dismissed because it's the insignificant detail as far as other people are concerned. These details are incredibly important. Picture the scene. Somebody doesn't press a button on a cruise ship. Or it was actually a ferry, sorry, it was a ferry ship. And the doors didn't close at the front of the ship from the loading bay. And because one button wasn't pressed, basically the ship capsized, lots of people died. Now, what we could focus on, of course, if we got it all wrong, is all of this stuff, all of the circumstance. I'm willing to bet that person who didn't press the button is replaying that moment, the not pressing a button. You see, here's the thing with post-traumatic stress. What happens or doesn't happen inside our psyche, our coding of the event, the way we think about it, the consequences are massively disproportionate to that. One man doesn't press one button, lots of people die. One man says, "Please don't kill me," and his whole masculinity, his whole welfare, his emotional welfare, his whole psychology, his whole mental health is destroyed. The consequences are usually way disproportionate, both in the actions that happen at the time, but also what happens inside our psyche. The soldier that doesn't pull the trigger and his best friend gets killed because he hesitated. That hesitation might have been 1/10 of a second, but that 1/10 of a second was all the thing that makes the difference. It's going to be about that 1/10 of a second delay. It's not going to be all the other stuff. That's easy for us to focus on. It's going to be very hard for them to describe. Here's another one. I was working in an accident department when I was in my 20s, and we were faced with the most horrific thing that I ever saw from a patient, from an accident. Now, I was on the trauma team. The team is all in there. We're doing the work. It's fairly obvious that this patient is not going to survive this, but we have to go through the motions. We have to do our best to try and to save them. But it's fairly clear what's going to happen. During this resuscitation, one of the nurses had broken open a drug ampule, and as she opened the ampule, the thing popped out from between her fingers, kind of somersaulted through the air and ended up inside the patient right in front of me. And I picked it out, dropped it to the side, and suggested we needed another one of those things. The thing wasn't coming to me, it was going to one of the doctors. That nurse disappeared later on that day. We couldn't find her. And it gets put out after a little while that there's actually, this could be serious, because no one really knows what's happened. We just know this nurse has vanished. She's not at home. Someone's phoned, someone's gone round the house. Basically, she's vanished. The next day, she turned up in one of the psychiatric units. Now, I had at the time no idea what had transpired or how that came about, but I bumped into her years later, and I asked her about it, and basically, it wasn't the horror of what we were faced with. It wasn't the screaming, the blood, the gore, the death, and the general discomfort of the whole thing. That was not the thing that messed her up. The thing that put her in the psychiatric unit for a few days and then had her off work for about 2 years, and she never went back to working as a clinician after that. She was a very experienced clinician, by the way. None of that stuff bothered her. What bothered her, she squeezed the ampule too tight. When we distill the whole thing down, the thing that got her, the thing that became symbolic for the whole thing for her, was simply that, squeezing it too tight and it popped out from her fingers. That's what her brain latched onto. That's the tiny moment for her. Now, when we identify what that moment is, generally, it's generally going to be a shame or a guilt or remorse or regret type scenario. The shaming bit is the most common aspect. Shame as an experience from post-traumatic stress is very common. The difficulty with this is that if we explore shame in the wrong way with the victim of post-traumatic stress, it will appear that somehow we're holding the client responsible for what happened. We're holding them responsible for all the stuff that's happened in their head since, and for the incident, and for other stuff. We very much get into the blaming the victim. And they've probably done that enough themselves. The repercussions. Oh, why did I say that? Why did I squeeze it too hard? Oh, why didn't I press the button? We get these tiny things. So as a clinician, I don't say those things. I just give the examples, and I'll go, so when we look at your thing, and we come to that point, do you know what it is I'm talking about? I've never had anyone say no. Often at that point when I go, do you know what it is I'm talking about? That the client will have a response, and it will be almost like a stress response, a panic response, because am I going to get them to say it out loud? Are they going to have to try and explain this to me? The chances are they may well have tried to explain it to people before, but no one got it. What I'll say is, do you know what it is I'm talking about here? Have you know that moment? Because what's important here is you don't need to try and explain it to me. What's important here is you know what it is we're dealing with. And do you know what it is we're dealing with? Usually, I've never had it not happen. The person identifies that yes. That is now the thing they think about when we get them to move their eyes. They think about this, they hold this in their mind. When people have used other therapeutic approaches, especially eye movement approaches, NLP approaches, tapping type work, most of the time that is unsuccessful, the person is concentrating on these events, the things that happened to them, and that's not necessarily going to be the thing that helps them. We've got to get them focusing on that one. Interestingly, what will happen here is you deal with that, the whole thing starts breaking down. It kind of, rather than being this great big mess of overwhelm the person has, which then leaks through into like flashbacks, those kind of things, when we deal with that, it becomes much more obvious about the reality of what's going on for them. And often just dealing with that one instance in time, we start to see quite a kaleidoscope of different emotions coming out. The person may well fluctuate very rapidly between different emotions and back again. I've seen people laughing and crying simultaneously whilst tensing up, almost like in anger. We get the gloved fist whilst they're laughing. You get significant body asymmetry. And some of the times they'll just sit there quietly and you don't see much on the outside at all. When working with that moment in time and moving the eyes around, It's a very simple thing that we're doing. And on the outside, it may appear that all they're doing is sitting there, moving their eyes as we wave our finger. You'll find that actually on the inside, there is an awful lot happening. And you may well need to come at this several times, but with lengthy gaps in between. We'll see people sometimes hyperventilate, they'll get tense, they'll get very hot and sweaty. Some people go, I'm sorry, I need to go out stand outside for a minute. Let the person deal with that however they deal with it. I don't see the reactions that we get here as part of a 3-stage abreaction process. And that's a very important distinction. When we're dealing with that moment in time, the person will deal with this in their own way and in their own time. When you're doing this with somebody, the elicitation here, the explanation here may take an hour. And if you're running a 1-hour session, you want to stop there. Don't get into doing that. Bring the person back for the next session and then do that, unless you have time to see it through. This is really important. I worked with a young child, 9-10-year-old age bracket. This child, unfortunately, was a victim of molestation by one of the parents. Now, not only now has he been molested by the parents, and he's bullied at school because he's a bit odd in his behaviour at school. Now the authorities are aware, and what's happened is that parent has now gone to jail and the child's been taken into foster care. That is a massive set of upheaval when you're that age. And not only has he then been subjected to various therapies, he's also now brought to me to see if there's anything I can do to help the kid. This is overwhelm for this child. There is too much, it's just too much for a young mind to deal with. Now, he was quite happy to work with me. I always get the consent from the child, and I explain, I'm not going to be doing necessarily what other people do. And I teach him this, and I go through this. Obviously, the examples I use are a little bit less severe than the ones I used here. Over 2 sessions, we start teasing out this data. Now, if you do that, use a flip chart, keep the paper. And obviously, the paper, that symbol, is very pertinent to that individual. So you treat this with some degree of respect because it's symbolic of them. So the way I care for your depiction demonstrates how I care for you, if that makes sense. So over 2 sessions, I did the elicitation of the details of the information because I needed him to understand the difference between the stuff he can do something about and the stuff that he can't. A child is not autonomous. They have to do as they're told, and when the authorities decide they do this, that's what the child has to do. Unfortunately, that's the thing. Then they have less ability and less control over stuff than an adult would, because they can't control their environment. They can't choose their environment either. So what I'm doing is I'm teasing out all of those things he can't do stuff about, identifying the stuff he can. It was on the 3rd session that I started the actual intervention, because obviously with a small child, a young child, my sessions are not going to be the 2-hour sessions that I normally do. On the 3rd session, we do that, and he knows exactly what I'm talking about when I say, okay, so when we refer to this, you know what it is I'm talking about? Look at my finger. Just keep thinking about that time and follow my finger. Just keep thinking about that, holding it in your mind for as long as you can. Now, whatever happens, happens. Just keep thinking about that. And we got all sorts of tears and all sorts of weird things. And over an hour, I just allow it. Whatever comes out, comes out. The eye movements, you don't need to do them for very long. Maybe about 10 seconds, maybe 20 seconds. If you're going for more than, I would say, 40 seconds, you've got to slow down and change what you're doing. 20 seconds, stop, recalibrate, take a break. Go and do something else, come back to it. Okay, let's start again. The brain takes time to process stuff. We've got brain chemistry that needs to do what brain chemistry does. Don't expect to get a result just like that and everything's fine. Remember, people's suffering goes far deeper than the pictures and the thoughts they make inside their head. It's really important. So even though we'll start to get changes, the physiology, the brain chemistry, may well take some days, even some weeks to sort itself out. And that's really important. Don't try and do all this in one go. Once you've dealt with that, you could go on to look at this. What are they doing afterwards? Sometimes a lot of the sequelae, the problems that are happening next, go away. So having dealt with that particular thing, okay, what about the alcohol? What about the drugs? What about the fact you're not connecting with your family? We might then need to go on and deal with those things. Often, many of those things just disappear on their own once you deal with this point. That's what I call the linchpin. Whatever you call it, make sure you just keep that consistent with your client if you're doing this over sessions. So when you think about the linchpin for you, you know what we're talking about? Good. Look at my finger. And we start to move the eyes. I don't refer to this as shame. I don't refer to this as the part that you played in all of this. And I don't try and infer or respond to any aspect of blame at all. It is what it is. And we work with just what it is. That's as simple. Now, the clients may present, oh, but that's shame, isn't it? And I go, if that's what you want to call it, we'll call it shame. So I don't bring the value judgment to it. I'll just use whatever they offer. But that doesn't happen very often. As always, comment section below. Any questions you have about this, I'll be interested. And also any experiences that you have, do please give the feedback. And of course, I'll see you in the next video.